Hey everyone, welcome back to another controller review. So today we're going to be looking at the HORI Battle Pad, which is basically a Gamecube style controller for your Nintendo Switch. Now if you followed my last review, we looked at the PDP version of the same sort of controller, but stay tuned because this one is actually way different in the overall gameplay. And like the last controller we did, we're not going to be reviewing this only for Smash Brothers because that's an easy answer. This is an excellent controller for Smash Brothers. And in a separate video, we're actually going to be putting head-to-head all the different Smash pads, as you could call them, to see which is really the best pad for Smash Brothers. But in this review, we're going to be looking if this can be your everyday controller if you play all types of games, as I review all my other controllers. So stay tuned because the results are actually way different than the PDP version of the controller because the two controllers have quite a few differences, although overall they look the same, they play really differently. So stay tuned and let's get to the review. First, let's go over feel and build quality. So by the way, if any of you were wondering why I have the Peach model of this controller, well, it's because after the review, this is going to be a gift for my 6-year-old daughter, who is a big fan of Peach, loves Smash Brothers, so I wanted to give her a little surprise. So once the review is done, this controller is going to be hers. So overall feel and build quality, honestly, I'm going to be giving this controller a 3 out of 5. The reason why is because unfortunately the controller, to my feel, is too light. I don't like a controller that is this light, and it's actually quite a bit smaller than a lot of its competitors. If I compare it directly to the PDP, for example, it does feel a lot smaller, meaning that when I'm holding it, the ZR and R buttons are not resting as comfortably as they were on the other model. And like I said, since it's so light, the plastic gives this sort of impression of a bit of a cheaper feel than the PDP version. Although it does seem sturdy, so I won't go any lower than a 3 out of 5, but overall, the build quality on this controller is decent. Now, for the features. So this controller actually is pretty decent feature-wise for a wired controller, but before we get to the special features it does have, let's go over quickly the stuff it doesn't have, because I'm pretty sure you're interested in that as well. So since it's a wired controller, well, obviously no rechargeable battery, no wireless functionality. Number 2, there's no rumble function. That's an oversight that I wish one day the wired controllers would start integrating. Number 2, unfortunately, there's no NFC compatibility, so you cannot read amiibos with this controller. There's no tilt sensor either, so there's no motion controls with it with the controller, but that's not unusual for a wired controller. It'd be very hard to integrate. However, the stuff it does have, it has actually quite a few extra special features. Number 1, the R and ZR buttons by default are inverted. The ZR is at the front, the R is at the back. And you can actually invert those to your preference. So depending on the game you're playing, you actually might want to flip the ZR and R buttons, which is a decently, good feature. Very few controllers allow you to do that. Number 2, there's a turbo functionality. So depending once again on the game you're playing and if you consider it cheating or not, the turbo functionality can actually be quite useful. So if you're playing some Mega Man and you need some button mashing skills that you don't necessarily naturally have, this controller can sort of help you out with that. And lastly, for the aesthetics, well, these controllers look pretty damn good. In my personal opinion, not as good as the PDP controller, but overall still pretty good. And lastly, the biggest thing is that the wired controller is actually 10 feet long, which is actually quite long for a controller. So it's a positive feature in my opinion. What that means is that overall, this controller is going to score a 6 out of 10 for the features, because the rumble, the long cord, the invertible buttons, and the turbo function are really all extra features, and on top of it, aesthetic-wise, it's worth at least an extra point. So it gives you a good, decent 6 out of 10. So now we get to the most important section, the gameplay results. So for the first category we're going to go over is 3D action and FPS games, and this is really where this controller is going to differ a lot from the PDP version if you saw my other review. And the reason why is that the second joystick here, which on the PDP you could swap out for a second traditional one, you're stuck with the C stick. And unfortunately, for any game where you actually need to aim or you need to move the camera a lot with the second joystick, this is actually a lot less comfortable and a lot less efficient. It also will be very hard to make minor adjustments, especially if like you're aiming with this in certain games. And overall, since this is a wired controller and you don't have motion controls, well, unfortunately, if your game has that experience to, integrated in it, you're not going to be able to partake in those type of options. So overall, in action, 3D action and FPS, unfortunately, this controller only gets a 5 out of 10. Meaning that you can still play these games, but it's probably not the best experience for you. If we move on now to the second gaming section, which is 2D side-scrollers or traditional 2D games, so 2D platformers, your Mega Mans, your traditional Mario games and whatnot. Well, once again, this controller is going to differ a lot from the PDP controller. The reason why, and it's actually one of the features HORI has on its box, this gives you a very large and very decent D-pad on it. So although on the PDP version of the Smash Pad, the D-pad you could see was an afterthought, was very small, wasn't very good at diagonals, on this controller you will have no problem. And especially if the game allows you to remap the buttons, it becomes very, very efficient. And if you guys didn't know, back in the day we were able to play all our games with Gamecube controllers, back in the Gamecube days. So if you get used to it and you get that muscle memory in there, you're going to be able to play 2D side-scrollers and 2D traditional games no problem with this controller, because the second joystick is not an issue in these games. What that means is that for 2D side-scrollers, I actually give this controller a very good 7 out of 10. It's not a great experience, but it's a very solid one. And now for our third section, traditional 2D fighters. So we're talking about Dragon Ball FighterZ, we're talking about Street Fighter, SNK games. Well, for this one, once again, this controller is going to outdo the PDP version, and because of this very decent D-pad, it's not a great one, but it's very, very decent. I will give another 7 out of 10. Once you got that muscle memory in for the button placements, it won't be a problem, and actually being able to swap R and ZR on this controller can give you a couple of options, especially if the game doesn't really allow you to remap the buttons very easily. The fact that you can actually swap them on the go is actually pretty decent. So once again, in this category, this controller outdoes the PDP version, and rather than making a bad experience, you have a pretty good gaming experience overall in this section. So for the last section, we have our racing games, Mario Kart, Crash Team Racing, and whatnot. So basically in this section, this controller will be getting a 6.5 out of 10. It's going to be lower than the PDP version, by the way. The reason why is because the controller is so small. It doesn't really sit comfortably to use the accelerator, the direction button, and the shoulder buttons at the same time. You see, I have to sort of use a claw grip where my fingers aren't resting comfortably on the shoulder buttons at the same time. For fighting games, it's perfect. It's fine because you're only doing quick presses. But for racing games where you're going to want to hold down while you use the joystick and whatnot, it'll become uncomfortable after a few hours of gameplay, which is why I can't score it as high. And secondly, once again, no tilt sensor means that you can't use that experience in these games. And although you can play these games without it, it's a negative. It's one of those things where you're just losing out on that part of the experience because you're using a wired controller. So it'll be scoring a little bit lower. So overall, these were the gameplay results. As I mentioned earlier, if you didn't catch it, for Smash Brothers, it's an excellent controller, and like I said, we'll be putting them all head-to-head very shortly. So overall, this puts this controller at a score of 34.5. So slightly lower than the PDP version of the controller, majority because, like I said, the feel and the size of the controller I find is a little bit too small. But then again, if you're buying this for a young child, like my daughter, it's actually a plus for that. And basically that's why I chose this model to get her, because number one, well, she's a huge fan of Peach, and even though PDP made a Peach version as well, I really knew the Hori version would be smaller and would be much better for her tiny hands. So if you're buying this for a child, the size factor might actually be a plus for you, and you could maybe add like a decent 2 to 3 points extra. So it's not a bad controller, it's just that for my feel, the size isn't appropriate, basically. So as usual, if you guys like this review, please like and subscribe. Also, there's going to be affiliate links down below if you want to pick up one of these Hori fight pads for yourself. You can use it, it gives a little kickback to the channel, helps me out to put out more content, buying more controllers to review for you guys. And as usual, I hope I'll see you guys in my next video.